My name is Mark Mullins. I am a neuroradiologist at Emory in Atlanta, and I want to say thank you to ACER and affiliated groups for inviting me to do this webcast today. This topic is near and dear to my heart. This is educational scholarship to advancing your career. I want to say thank you to Carrie O'Connor, who's done some great work setting this up. And Carrie, do you mind to go to the next slide, please? All right, this is my conflict of interest slide. Not much relevant to this particular topic today, but I do collaborate with one of my colleagues on as you can see, on a grant. Next slide, please. All right, so the way I'm going to do this particular talk is I'm going to talk about a few things that I think are pertinent to understanding what somebody might care about in terms of this topic. And as you know, this is a whole lecture series. So I'm going to try to focus on the topic at hand today, advancing your career. Hopefully it'll be interactive. If you want to send in questions or comments via the chat, feel free. Otherwise, you can get me offline if you want to. I'm going to talk about my experience a little bit. There's not a lot that I'm familiar with in terms of research in this field, so a lot of it's going to be experiential. But yeah, if you want to shout at me some other way, especially offline, feel free, and I'd be glad to talk to you about this topic. Next slide, please. All right, so I did want to reference one article that we put out in the ACER newsletter in 2013. It's a little dated now, but a lot of it is still very pertinent to what's going on these days. I'll cover a little bit of the material in that particular article, and we'll put some other things as well, so not just the material in the article. Next slide, please. All right, so the teacher in me says we need to do some learner-centered learning objectives, and you probably saw these in the posting for this particular teaching session. Hopefully this will be the only thing I'm going to read to you today, so I'm going to read these out just to make sure we cover them. Examine how academic scholarship is assessed, detect opportunities for academic scholarship, and develop a personal plan to optimize their academic scholarship output to enhance their career. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to make a few assumptions as we go through these topics today. The first of which is that I hope that you're interested in succeeding in this field of academic radiology. I hope that you either have, will in the future think about how you'd like your career to progress. And an expression that I like to use in general is hopefully you care about something. This field of radiology has a great big umbrella, and a lot of things that people are interested in can be tied to radiology in one way or another, and then hopefully that leads to better academic scholarship. So the idea is it's hard to finish projects even if you care a lot about them. Hopefully if you care about them, that will make it more likely to finish it, more likely to do a good job of it, maybe more likely to have positive attributes and accolades, like maybe awards or grants or opportunities to speak on the subject. Maybe if you care about it a lot, it might turn into a passion, and hopefully you can take a small flame and turn it into a larger flame in that passion, as a metaphor. Next slide, please. All right, so in terms of figuring out where you're headed, one of the things to figure out is what do you want out of this process. So you might be able to predict that the next slide is going to be assessments outside of you, but let's start with you. You know, what do you think is going to be satisfactory to you and or going to help you advance your career? And start with yourself. You know, is your answer going to be to get promoted to professor? Is your answer going to be that you want people to recognize you in terms of your work at a place far away from you? Is it that you want to write a textbook? You want to be known for that? Is it that you want to achieve certain things in terms of innovation and these other kind of what I call objective success criteria aren't as important to you? So start with yourself. Start to figure out what you feel like will be success. And little foreshadowing for something we'll talk about later, but it's presumable that this will change over time. So your perspective on this will change over time, and that's as it should be as far as I'm concerned. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, this whole concept of personal strategic planning. So I'll circle back around to that. And, you know, this is where I want you to start. You know, what are you going to consider success? Next slide, please. Okay, so next, you want to figure out what your boss is going to consider to be success. So the idea there is that, okay, if you feel like you're on a path to success and you've achieved certain things that you've laid out for yourself to achieve in terms of your career, but your boss is unhappy, then that's probably going to be a problem. And vice versa, if you're unhappy but your boss is happy, that's probably going to turn into a problem before too long. So we got to try to figure out a way to sync those two up. And it doesn't have to be in the Venn diagram that there's only one circle, right? It doesn't have to be that one subsumes the other or there's an identical fit between the two. It doesn't have to be like that. It could just be the idea that you're going to have goals for your career, and hopefully there's some synergy between what your goals are and what your boss's goals are for you. And this is one of the things I try to talk to graduating residents or fellows looking for jobs about, is that I feel like if your value system and a potential job's value system are not aligned, it's probably only a matter of time until it falls apart. And this analogy, I think, works really well for this concept of, you know, how do you advance your career with academic scholarship? So the things you're going to focus on. And I think in the modern world, there's a big focus on what people like. So I like to do this, I like to do that, and so that becomes something that, you know, I might gravitate towards, you know, traditionally. In addition to that, I feel like you need to know yourself in terms of what you don't like, and then in addition to that, what you're good at. So I think those are the three components as far as I'm concerned. It's not just what you like, but those other two as well. And that can fit in nicely. And then this phase, this step right here is figuring out, are you going to be okay if you have a focus in particular areas and you feel like that's what you want to focus on in terms of academic scholarship, educational scholarship, but then maybe your boss has other ideas, that's going to be an issue. Now, notice I left it vague as to what your boss is. You may have several bosses, and I'm sure you've already realized that that can be even more demanding, and they may have different ideas of what they think is what you ought to be focusing on. So in any case, start with yourself and then move on to the people doing your assessments to try to figure out what you're going to focus on. Next slide, please, Carrie. Great, thank you. Now, let's focus on academic promotion for a minute. I don't mean to say that this is the only form of focus that somebody may have in terms of career goals, but for many of us, this is a big one, right? So let's start here. Let's talk about academic promotion. Now, the programs, the schema are different in different places. I'm familiar with the one we have here, and I've become familiar with the schemes that they have at many other places, but certainly not all of them. I mean, that's for sure. I don't know all of them, and I maybe don't know details at lots of places, but I do know kind of in general terms how it works at many places. What you need to understand is how it works in the place you are currently. And if you're planning to move or it's a possibility that you're going to move, get to know your new system as well. Now, a lot of times nowadays they'll put a lot of this information online and you can look it up, but I'm also going to point out that quite often there's granular information that many of us would like to have, which is just not there. So, for example, how many articles that we should have published by whatever criteria within whatever amount of time to be considered for a particular type of promotion. Many of us would love to have that kind of information and could maybe work off of that to figure out what we ought to be doing. But that type of granularity is really hard to come by. So one of the things I'm going to suggest is look for connections and networking in your particular institution of people who have experience in either being on these committees or mentoring, or both. So the idea is that there are many departments that have an internal committee, promotions committee, that has a lot of experience in their own department, not necessarily with the rest of the university. And then if you're in a university-based program, and if it is a university piece, maybe there are people outside of the department or people inside the department that have had that experience that can give you some perspective. And they may be able to give you guidance. And what I suggest that you do is reach out and just introduce yourself to these individuals and ask them if they will do essentially like a curbside to maybe look at your teaching portfolio, your learning portfolio, your service portfolio, your CV, those kind of things, and to look and see how they think you're doing in terms of your goals. And so those are things that I think can be quite helpful to sit down and get somebody's input. Personally, I feel like the times to do this would be a couple of years before you want to go up for any promotion, and then intermittently after that. I would do it no more than maybe every 6 months, maybe once a year, something like that. And you certainly don't want to do it to ask for this kind of input so often that it becomes annoying to the people that you're asking for help, okay? And then, figure out your own system. That's kind of that first line. Second line pertains to many tracks that places have nowadays. And I would assume that many of the people who will watch this webinar are probably on some sort of medical educator track. Those are pretty commonplace these days. And in my opinion, what these tracks do is de-emphasize extramural funding, which is uncommon for educators in my experience, and also de-emphasize scholarship and emphasize educational excellence. And different places have a different focus, and this is a way for institutions to be able to distinguish themselves. And it's one of those things you just got to sort of sort out, to look at and see what your own particular version is. Now, in your place, you may want to change tracks. I'm familiar with the concept that in places, some places at least, they don't like to do more than one change, right? So you want to pick your moments to figure out which track you want to do. You may be in a place that you can do unlimited track changes, who knows? And you may be in a place that had tracks and is now going trackless. There are all sorts of different variations to this. But number one, you figure out which track you're on and be familiar with that, and then figure out all your other options of what the other tracks are and figure out how you could fit into those other schema, right? So that this third one is probably something I assume if you're watching this webinar that you're very interested in, how scholarship assessed. Now, certainly I'm not speaking for everybody. I'd never do that. That's not something that I don't feel that even can be done to answer this question. However, there are, I think, some commonalities that are typical and characteristic of this. So, scholarship is easily the biggest area that I see people run into trouble trying to get promoted with an educational background. So maybe they're focused a lot on teaching. And as we know as educators, our lives are busy doing all sorts of different things, especially if you're the director of some educational program, very busy. And so one of the first things that seems to go once you take over a directorship is your ability to produce larger amounts of scholarship. So that's really a challenge. And so one of the reasons I'm glad that this webinar series exists. So a lot of the systems I'm familiar with for educators assessing scholarship is the idea that, okay, there's the traditional triple threat, right? Clinical practice, education, and or teaching if you prefer, and research. And then basically, when you look at that, the idea is to be outstanding at 2 of the 3 and not bad at the 3rd. And different places use different verbiage and maybe emphasize these things a little bit different. So one of the traps people typically fall into would be, that they are good at all 3 but not really outstanding in any of them. Or maybe they're outstanding clinically but only good at teaching and research. So you can imagine it would be challenging to consider promoting somebody in that particular situation. But if somebody had a focus, right, if they focus, you kind of get to choose one. If they have focus in teaching or focus in research, okay, and they're excellent clinically or outstanding clinically, okay, there's a particular situation where we want to focus and say, all right, well, how does scholarship fit into that? Oftentimes, scholarship is either integrated into those considerations individually, or it's a separate category that's on top of those classic three, right? And so one of those would be participation. So that's the most common situation I see, is that people need to keep participating in scholarship. And this doesn't mean doing 5 articles 1 year and doing 0 for 4 years. So one of the things people will look for is sustained scholarship, so participation. So is someone participating? Now, in a perfect world, you'd be first author or last author, and it would be in a high-impact journal, and you know, those would be, you know, and the topics would all kind of go together. They would be referenced a lot, and you know, I mean, that's kind of the perfect world of how the scholarship would work. But in real world, you know, sometimes we're first author, sometimes we're last author, sometimes we're in the middle. A few things to focus on. One would be first author and last author tend to count more. First authorships sometimes count more depending on the phase of your career, and then last authorships count a little more based on a different time in your career, but can be different from place to place. If you work with a trainee and the trainee is first author and you're second author, oftentimes people will give you an equivalency for that it would be like first author because you're mentoring someone. There's some places that would give you maybe extra emphasis for mentoring someone and working with trainees. And then, of course, collaboration, having multiple different people that you write manuscripts with, as far as that goes. Sometimes people worry about being linked up with someone, like maybe you've had a mentor and you've written a lot of papers with them, and then at some point you want to transition to where you're the last author, you know, that's a transition to kind of be on the lookout for. I've been on the research side, I've been on the teaching side. I will say I think that's more of a research side thing than a teaching side thing, but you should bear in mind that's just my own personal opinion as far as that goes. And I think that this is frequently the kind of thing where you want to be participating over time. So what I suggest that you do in this regard is to focus on having some things that you would be first author on, some things you'd be, you know, last author on, and then be a collaborator, be a co-author on some other. And you want to focus on having it work out over a several-year time frame. And we'll talk, again, this is a little foreshadowing for the personal strategic planning for later, but you want to have a several-year time frame, and so that things are coming to maturity over the course of time. And so then there would be kind of participation like that. Now, of course, there may come to pass a year that you don't publish anything. I mean, this happens, but the idea is that you're going to try to spread it out over time. And hopefully that's going to be easier on you as well, rather than trying to push and get, you know, 3 papers out at once, maybe focusing on 1 at a time or maybe even just 2 at a time so that you get it down to where it's manageable as well. So in summary, that last line on this slide is probably something you care a lot about. Try to figure out at your own individual place how these kind of things work, and then try to avoid falling into the traditional trap of taking on a lead educator position, maybe even a directorship in education, and then falling into the trap of saying, okay, well, I'm focusing on this, and then you look up and it's 3 or 4 years later and you haven't published anything in a while. Volunteer to work with your collaborators to be co-authors, find things that you can be first author on, try to be continuous about it, try to say, okay, I'm going to focus on having, you know, one or 2 papers come out every year. And then, yes, of course, focus on quality and objective success criteria like we were talking about before. Carrie, next slide, please. All right, so here are some forms of educational scholarship. This may be covered elsewhere in this lecture series as well, but I'm going to cover it a little bit here and give you my take on it also. So of course, the traditional thing is publications in journals. We talked about, there's impact factor, there's how many times it's downloaded or cited, does it win awards. Those are definitely some things to focus on. The next one is online publications. This is obviously something that has been in more recent years than it was obviously decades ago. So how much does this count? It's unclear. It's unclear from place to place. Although if you can pull data that shows how many times this is accessed, and if that data is impressive, that may carry a lot of weight. It may. Online posts, even more ethereal. I'm not exactly sure how this would factor in, but I know that there's been a push to try to figure out how to include social media into consideration of academic scholarship and all the other things that kind of come with that. So I know that that's a push nowadays. I'm doing this talk in March of 2018. If you're listening to it, in future years, it may be that this is commonplace now. I mean, I could see how that might eventually be the case. I think that people really like numbers and like data, and this is the kind of thing that lends itself nicely to data, like the analytics that go along with it. Books. So it's not common really for radiologists to write books, but it's something that people do. And I remember someone telling me an analogy about going up for promotion as a radiologist is that, as opposed to someone, say, from another field like history or literature, that they may be able to go in and say, okay, here, just sort of say, here are my books, here's my scholarship. Of course, some radiologists have books, and that's great, and it is maybe something that's important to you. You may focus on it, but it's not commonplace, I don't think, just in terms of a focus, but something I aspire to personally as well. There's formal and informal. Obviously, if you're going to try to get credit for it, the closer you can get to formal, the better, right? So the idea is to figure out how you're going to document that, that you did some sort of scholarship and give people the opportunity to see that as the positive thing that you think it is. And so informal things, it's going to be very challenging. Please do try to look at opportunities or things that you've already done in terms of your educational, professional life and say, is there any way for me to get credit for this? Is there any way for me to turn it into something which could be construed as academic scholarship? Part of this is the idea of opportunity, to be able to look at a situation and say, okay, I see that this is I've done this as good work. How can I possibly share it with others? How can I possibly have people look at it and say, that is academic scholarship? And so we'll talk about a few examples of that as we go through this talk, but just kind of keep that in mind. So it's a big word, opportunity. So you look at it, you see the opportunity to be able to turn something into academic scholarship, and then hopefully that will help you with your career. And then, of course, there's traditional and non-traditional. One of the keys that seems to come up, I see very frequently around education, is the idea of innovation, right? And it's big for medicine, sure. It's big for radiology, sure, of course. But don't forget it's something about education as well. Some places may even focus their promotion criteria on what kind of impact that you've had in education in some sphere, local, regional, national, international, those kind of things. When it comes down to it, it's really not very common for people as educators in medical schools to have an impact that's international, right? That's just to change things that people use in across the entire world. It occasionally happens, but that's not a very common place. However, the impact that somebody can have nationally and internationally, you can definitely have an impact there and you can definitely have things that you do that make a difference. So that can be there. All right, we'll talk about, that next line, studies versus descriptive, or how we do it kind of articles. True research in the field of education, at least in radiology, is not very common. Much more common are descriptive type articles. We came up with this, we came up with that. Here's how we put together this program. Here's how here's the lessons we've learned and advice that we have for others. These are quite useful, right? So one of the things that I like to note when I go to meetings is how much of it that I found useful, right? And I'm sure you do it too. So the idea there is when I go to some of our educational meetings, I find the descriptive stuff very useful oftentimes. So the idea is that they've tried to address a problem, they've come up with some solution, it's worked to some degree for them, and they wanted to share it. And oftentimes we are having a similar problem, and we want to address it too. And so I personally find this very useful. So the question I ask myself before I go off and try to write a paper like this or work with people to write a paper like this is the idea that could this help someone else? Could someone else find this useful? And if the answer is yes, I think it's worthwhile doing it. Even one other person, if you want to change one life for the better, that's a good reason to work on something. And then this last line on the right-hand side, durable. So the idea here is that there may be things that you've worked on that in the old days, what they would say is, okay, try to find a way to turn it into something that would be printed. That's what it used to be. You print it out, maybe even bind it up, a syllabus, a curriculum, and it's kind of working towards a book. So the idea is durable. And then at one point in time, it switched over to electronic media, but then you needed to burn it on a CD or a DVD. Nowadays, obviously, in this electronic era, there's even less of an emphasis on stuff like that. But the concept, I think, is still good. You may be coming up with fantastic ideas around educational curricula, paradigms, teaching techniques. You may be very innovative, and what you're doing may be fantastic work, but try to see that opportunity to be able to turn it into something that's more durable. So fleshing it out to become something that's more of a full and complete syllabus that might have utility, and then to say, okay, here's the product, here's what I've worked on, this handbook, this syllabus, this curriculum, here's what maybe, again, on the local level, but then are you doing anything like that in a collaborative fashion or sharing with other places? How does that work? So that's what durable means there. Next slide, please. All right. Jim Provenzali used to be here at us with Emory when he was splitting time with Duke, and I've learned many things from Pro over the years. This is one I want to give him a shout out for in particular. Two of the things here. One, the first line, he would say, and I'm paraphrasing, the idea that you're sitting there and you come up with a question and you look for an answer to the question and you can't find it. So that's an opportunity. And I want you to think about this not only in the clinical arena, but also in the education arena, right? So this is an opportunity for you that you might be able to contribute and maybe answer that question, and then that leads us organically to the next line. You may even get some credit for it, right? So his analogy would be, I remember that what he would talk about is to say, if somebody asks you to do a talk, try to figure out how to get a paper out of it. So as an analog to that, if you go back and say, okay, there's that opportunity in the first line to be able to answer a question, maybe there's an opportunity to write it up, not just to answer it. And maybe you can go 3 for 1. Maybe they'll ask you to even talk about it. Maybe it can be local talk, national talk, or you can answer a question, get a paper out of it, and get a talk. So they're just things to think about. And again, the big word here, opportunity. You got to see opportunity in this and realize when you come upon a situation, how you might be able to take it, and then develop it so that it comes back to you, and then hopefully that helps with your career progression as well. Next slide, please. So for the triple threat, this is sort of a classic thing. I was trained to be a triple threat. We talked about it a little bit earlier, clinical practice, teaching, and research. I don't personally believe that that one is able to be a classical triple threat, being outstanding in all three at the same time for any extended period of time. Even just keeping up with the reading in any one particular area is very daunting in today's world. Just the amount of information is so much. So why do I bring this up? I bring it up because I don't want people to feel like a failure if they're not outstanding at all three at a particular time. Now, I believe an individual can be outstanding at all three over the course of their career, and I think when you're a medical doctor, being outstanding clinically needs to be a priority, but then you kind of get to focus on what the other ones are, and as I said earlier, try to not be bad at the third, right? So if you choose research, try to not be bad as a teacher. If you choose teaching, try to not be bad at research. And I assume if you're watching this, you're focusing on education. What does that mean, not being bad at research? So the idea is to participate from time to time, even if you're not a PI. Try to be a collaborator. Try to be a co-investigator with some other papers, and hopefully that helps with your academic output as well. And then you can participate in that regard. It'll also help give you perspective for what goes into production of a successful research project leading all the way to publication. Next slide, please. Now, I believe that marketing without substance is evil, but if you have substance and you don't market, then I believe that that's a lost opportunity. So hopefully you have substance and you want to try to figure out how to put your best foot forward. So this delicate balance goes way back in our lives, right? When you're applying for, the first things you did interviews for, applications for, all the way till now, right? And so this is just a way to get your best foot forward. Try to figure out how to market yourself, and just don't forget that this is kind of part of it. But first and foremost, start with substance. Be of substance, and then figure out how to put yourself in a good position to succeed beyond that. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to mention a few line items here. This is a slide that focuses on things that people will look at to try to figure out how you're doing, not only for, say, maybe a yearly evaluation, but every so often figuring out how your career is progressing. Obviously, we're going to start with the CV. We don't have the time today to focus on everything that goes into that, nor these other things, so I'm just going to mention them and kind of move on. You may still have a learning portfolio from when you were in training. Maybe you still utilize it. That may be useful. Maybe it's just for you. Maybe it's something you want to share. There's different versions of that. The teaching portfolio, and then we talked about those real or durable products. And when I say real in that regard, what I mean is, again, something you can hold or something in that regard. But again, I want to de-emphasize the idea of, okay, it has to be printed or it has to be on a DVD. In the modern era, I think we've moved beyond that. But the idea that instead of just saying, okay, I've come up with a list of topics for conference, I have put together instead a robust curriculum that people are going to do. There's required readings, suggested readings, assessments, topics, of course. It's robust. There's a fullness to it that makes it real in this regard. Evaluation. So in terms of career progression, a common thing that people need to focus on is not only getting better at their craft, so getting evaluations and feedback, but also showing people who assess you that this is something that you care about. And so having an evaluation system and keeping track of your evaluations and having them ready to be able to share if the question comes up. Now, part of it's focusing on, okay, how did you use them to get better, but also just having the material. Of course, if the evaluations are glowing, that's great, that's fantastic. And in my experience, people, I remember many years ago I did a 360 evaluation, and the coach that was assigned to me for that told me that people tend to like to work on things that they're good at and not work on things that they're not good at, but that neutralizing a negative can be quite useful in terms of making somebody better overall. And so these evaluations may help identify blind spots that you have and may be useful in that regard. If you're not getting evaluations, then you can address that. You can actually participate such that you can ask for evaluations. You can also come up and use your own evaluations so that people are giving you that feedback. And I have colleagues that have, you know, hundreds and maybe even thousands of different evaluations that they have done themselves and they've kept track of. So that's very robust information for them and shows others a very positive thing just in terms of career progression. Recommendations, obviously, reputation leads to reputation, that kind of thing. Don't forget that you are going to need to be known to others if you want to have a national or international reputation, and part of it is the scholarship that you focus on, but part of it's also getting out, networking, doing talks, meetings, those kind of things as well. But doing educational scholarship, getting that out there and getting it so that people see that and think, okay, have a positive reputation, those kind of things, that can be quite useful. In my experience, it isn't commonplace for academic environments to have a robust visiting professor program around education. So in terms of educators being invited for something like this, not a very common thing. It does happen, but it's not a very common thing. And so that makes it a little more uphill in terms of someone taking academic scholarship and being able to get promoted from that regard. Imagine in contradistinction, you know, how it would compare to, say, somebody who publishes a clinical article and it's something that people read and say, well, I'd really like to have this person as a grand round speaker, as a visiting professor. Kind of a different thing. But yeah, just something to as an observation. Next slide, please. All right, so a few line items here. I put in all caps. I try not to use all caps because it sounds like I'm shouting, but as you can tell, I'm not shouting. But I do want you to recognize this line item, and I want you to recognize opportunities. So figuring out that it's there. And so every now and then somebody will ask me as a program director, you know, what are some of my disappointments? This would be one of those things, just people not taking advantage of opportunity. And this is where I want you to see these kind of opportunities as they come up. And hopefully that will organically help with somebody's career. You have to have priorities, and obviously being a great clinician comes first and foremost. And, you know, as we talked about, your priorities may change over time. You have to be highly organized. You do have to have a plan, but be willing to change it. When I was a junior faculty member, one of the things I learned was people said that successful people tend to have nonlinear career progression. And so I've tried to be open to that as time has gone on. Becoming a program director was one of those things for me. It was not something that I thought a lot about before I did it. Produce outstanding work. Obviously, even for the academic scholarship that you're doing, that should absolutely apply to this as well. And of course, networking should help. And amongst other things, it can open up avenues for you to collaborate with somebody else. So I think that that's a useful thing as well. Next slide, please. All right, keep your CV and your teaching portfolio up to date. The idea here is that what I remember years ago people would say is have an inbox and an outbox for your CV. So as you do things, so maybe you do things as an educator, maybe you're on the faculty for some course for your university, just have an inbox. If you do it electronically, great. If you want to physically print them out and put them into a bin, a physical bin. That's one way to do it. I know some people use folders, and then as they add these things, then they'll file it away. So keep track of that. Keep a filing system where you keep it, don't get rid of it. Keep your documentation and your teaching portfolio basically the same way, and intermittently go through it and make sure it's up to date. And if your experience is anything like mine, the formatting for these things changes over time for your place, so you got to keep track of that as well. There's the keep documentation next line, just like I said. I personally believe that you need to have multiple mentors. I like the Mosaic mentorship model. I like how it all fits together. And one of the best ways that I feel like you can be a better mentee is to be a mentor. And I think that will help just in terms of this regard. So in terms of this topic, this is something that I and others end up mentoring people on. And so just reach out and try to find someone that may serve in this capacity for you or others. If you're successful, eventually you're going to have to figure out how to say no to opportunity and when. It's going to be a life skill, and that's why having multiple mentors really helps. For the Mosaic mentorship model, I usually espouse having mentors in your own place, but then also mentors from the outside. You need to have people that understand your particular place, and you need to have people that are outside the place and can provide you with that perspective as well. In terms of figuring out what you're going to consider success, remember we're talking about your career. There are a few things here which may have a local system, and if there is a local system, be sure that you know what it is and if there are changes and what they are. Salary, incentive, promotion, and consideration of leadership positions. So become very familiar with those, stay engaged, and if you care about any of these things, try to figure out what's important to you about them and how that's going to fit into how you, what you do and how you manage yourself. You're really going to need to know how to work within systems. My guess is if that you're listening to this webcast, you've probably already learned how to work within systems, but this is going to be extremely important. If you're trying to go uphill both ways within a system, your career progression is going to be very challenging, right? So that's going to be a very difficult situation. If you find yourself at odds with a particular place in terms of the value system, like the things that you do, you enjoy, you're good at, you don't get much credit for them, you're going to have to ask yourself some hard questions, in terms of where you are and what you're doing. Next slide, please. Right, so the classic expression people will talk about is find a niche and fill it or create a niche and fill it, right? So that's the classic thing that people would say. There's, I think, some pertinence to education as well, so educational scholarship, trying to find a way to be the person that is known for a particular area. So, for example, a recent topic which sort of became very hot was gamification, right? So right now it's AI, right? So the idea would be that if you are producing scholarship which fits a hot topic, all the better. And if there's not much out there on this topic, even better still, because hopefully what will happen is people will think of you as the authority in this particular area. And of course, that's going to help all those downstream things in terms of career progression. This may be very different from what you thought you were going to do. Maybe there's a topic that you like, but there are so many other people that do it. It's going to be, how do you distinguish yourself? Do you have to distinguish yourself? It kind of depends on where you are and how their system works and what you are personally going to consider success. But maybe a more direct path to career success may come from something that you didn't necessarily think was going to be your focus, but that it provides great opportunity for you. In terms of some friendly advice, try to figure out ways to be innovative, be a leader, be dependable. Those are things that probably should serve you well. And see the opportunity in all of those to try to figure out how you can parlay those into academic scholarship. And then, of course, present at meetings and be involved in organized radiology. And hopefully that will open up additional opportunities for you to collaborate with others or have a platform for your particular creative solutions to be able to develop more academic scholarship. Next slide, please. All right, Ernie Garcia is former Vice Chair for Research here, and I've learned several things from him. One of them is this concept of personal strategic planning. And the idea is that you would every so often look at where you are and where you're going and try to reverse engineer that. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Reverse engineer that to what you're doing now. And so the way I think about it is you shouldn't do it more than every 6 months. Probably every year is a good time to do it, a good frequency. And you want to look and say, okay, what's my 1-year plan, my 5-year plan, and my 10-year plan? Your 1-year plan, you ought to be actually doing the things right now. They should be close to completion so that they pay off in a year's time. The 5-year plan, you need to start the things now so that they pay off in 5 years. And the 10-year plan is where you're headed, right? You're off in the distance, like where you're going. And as I said before, things can and should change over time. Like your priorities at one point might be to produce a large number of manuscripts. And at another phase, you may say, well, I want to produce fewer manuscripts that are of higher quality. Or maybe you want to produce manuscripts in academia that are on a particular topic, so you want to have a focus. And these things may evolve over time, and it should also have a pertinence to where you are in terms of the process, right? So you look at your CV, you talk to people who have some insight to figure out what the kind of things you should be working on to fill it in so that you're on track to come up for promotion. So things to focus on, but this gives you kind of a built-in schedule, so to speak, and a format and an organization and a scheme to look at and say, okay, here's how I'm going to go through it. I think that's very useful. Next slide, please. All right, so over the last, it's a little bit less than an hour at this point. We've talked about several things. I want to point out in a summary format just a few things to talk about here as we're summing up. I want you to focus on opportunity, to see opportunity there, to realize that as a teacher, in most systems that I'm aware of anyway, you still have to participate in scholarship. Early on in your career, I don't know that I necessarily went through this explicitly earlier, but early on in your career, I personally like to see people trying different things and seeing what they're good at, what they like, what they don't like. And then as they come to mid-career, I like to see them have a focus. So that's what I like. Other people may see it differently, but I like that. And if we're doing this as clinicians and also as educators, I like the idea that, hopefully somebody would have a participation in both of those arenas if they want to make a name for themselves as a clinician educator. I like, sort of that approach as well. Of course, there are ways to subcategorize the productivity, right? So numbers of manuscripts, impact factor, other bibliometrics, H-index. There's all sorts of different ways. And I think, as I said before, people gravitate towards data and numbers. I understand why, because you can look at a series of numbers and say, okay, this is higher than that, and therefore, blah, 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 right? I kind of understand why people like that approach, but personally, I feel like there's more to it than that, and that's where I think having people's perspective outside of yourself to say, okay, okay, what's your reputation? What are you known for? And those kind of things help to go along with that data and those numbers. In terms of promotion, one of the other things to focus on in addition to that is figuring out, where you have those gaps, trying to be really great at being a clinical doctor, and then trying to be really great at being an educator, but then, turning some of that into educational scholarship. The most traditional way is to get it into journals, right, into abstracts and articles, printed materials like that, electronic or otherwise. that's more traditional, but then try to figure out how to find ways that would distinguish you in that regard. And then going back again, figuring out for your own self, what are you going to consider success? What are your priorities? And then how do you actualize that? And then what's your boss going to consider success? And then within that frame, what's your plan going to be? And then every so often, come back to your plan. It should evolve over time. See how you've done with your plan so far, and figure out, your next, 1 year, 5 year, and 10-year plans going forward. So anyway, thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Acer. Carrie, you can show the last slide there. Thank you. And so, as I said, if you have any questions, feel free to track me down. My name's Mark Mullins. My Emory email is memulli@emory.edu.